We begin here this hour. The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs that he pursued under a law meant for use in national emergencies, rejecting one of his most contentious assertions of his authority in a ruling with major implications for the global economy. The justices, in a 6-3 ruling, upheld a lower court's decision that the Republican president's use of a 1977 law exceeded his authority. The Supreme Court reached its conclusion in a legal challenge by businesses affected by the tariffs and 12 U.S. states, most of them Democratic governed, against Trump's unprecedented use of this law to unilaterally impose the import taxes. All right, and for more on this, let's now cross live to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce Pease, live from us in New York. And Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. I mean, major developments coming in this afternoon, particularly when it comes to those tariffs. What does this all mean for U.S. President Donald Trump?
A very frustrating day, one imagines, for the U.S. president. This has been, Mbali, as you well know, a central peg of his domestic economic policy, his foreign economic policy, and sometimes bleeding into geopolitical policy in terms of using the economic stick that the United States has wielded around the world to get a certain kind of acquiescence from countries around the world on issues that might not be directly related to the U.S. economic growth or GDP growth and the like. And essentially what you see now from the Supreme Court in the 6-3 split decision, the three conservative justices joining their liberal counterparts in affirming two lower court rulings in that regard. In May of last year, the U.S. Federal Trade Court here in Manhattan blocked the tariffs, ruling that the president had exceeded his authority in terms of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA of 1974. He used this act to impose tariffs. That was then again struck down by the D.C. Court of Appeals, a 7-4 decision in August of last year. And so this is now the third and highest court. This is the last constitutional avenue that the president has here in terms of the imposition of these tariffs. The court ruling that he's exceeded his authority, that the power to impose a tax, which a tariff is mandated or the purview of the United States Congress. And they read, there's a reading of the act in the judgment in Bali. I just want to read you very briefly. The IEEPA also authorizes the president to investigate, block during the pendency of an investigation, regulate and compel, nullify, void, prevent, and prohibit. So it lists the actions that the act gives the president the power to do. They then write, absent from this lengthy list of powers is any mention of tariffs or duties. That omission is notable in light of the significant but specific powers Congress did go to the trouble of naming. It stands then to reason that had Congress intended to convey the distinct and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, it would have done so expressly, as it consistently has done in other tariff statutes. It also says that the president asserts the independent power to impose tariffs on imports from any country, on any product, at any rate, for any amount of time. Chief Justice Roberts, who penned or authored the judgment for the majority, writes, those words cannot bear such weight. Those words cannot bear such weight. So the president does not have the authority to impose a tax or a tariff. That is the purview of Congress. That is the separation of powers principle, what they call a major questions doctrine in terms of legal speak here. That is the purview of the United States Congress. And so the president, his central economic policy here is being undercut by the courts. The question now becomes, what will this White House do in response?
And I was coming there, Sherwin, when it comes to the response from the White House. Are they saying, have they reacted to this latest news?
Well, this judgment should come as no surprise. I mean, two courts have already struck down the tariffs. They were hoping for a complete turnaround in terms of the Supreme Court decision, but the Supreme Court has amplified what two lower courts had already ruled. So we understand that there has been planning in terms of using alternative statutes to impose the tariffs. Look, I think the plain answer here is that the tariffs are not necessarily going to go away. The question is, what different statutes will the president use to impose tariffs moving forward? What does all of this mean in terms of AGOA's reauthorization earlier this year, and the whether it's going to apply all the way back to September, and what that sort of benefit in terms of the free trade agreement in terms of AGOA means in terms of these tariffs now being struck down. What I can give you an example of is another option that the president has in Bali. There is something called Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. It allows the president to impose tariffs to address trade deficits, but those would be limited to only 15% and only for 150 days. So you can begin to understand the limits that other statutes would then impose on the president's powers, and why, for example, he then preferred using the IEEPA that gave him sort of, illegal but sweeping authority to impose tariffs at any number on any person at any time based on the president's preference here. And so in terms of other statutes moving forward, we'll have to wait for the White House to come out and pronounce themselves on this, but there would be various limitations imposed on the president's authority, and then again you might see some challenges in the courts, right? We might be at the beginning of another judicial review here in terms of moving forward. So too many questions that we have, not many answers quite yet.
And I mean, Sherwin, this gave birth to what we now know as trade wars, and it not only affected South Africa, but it affected the globe. But when we bring it back home, what does this ruling mean for AGOA, and what does it mean for South African trade?
Well, how we understood it in Bali was that AGOA was superseded by the reciprocal tariffs. Now that the reciprocal tariffs have been ruled illegal by the highest court in the land, one then imagines that sort of backdated to September, in terms of which AGOA has been renewed, sort of backdated till September, do those original benefits, the free trade benefits, if you're a beneficiary from sub-Saharan Africa, do the AGOA benefits then retrospectively to September last year kick in and override what would have been the reciprocal tariffs since August of last year? These are some of the technical questions we need to come to terms with, really come to understand. But essentially, the $175 billion that has been taken in terms of tariffs in the United States, do we now get refunds? Do companies that have borne the cost of those punitive measures, do they then get refunds? What does that process look like? Is it a messy process? These are things that we still have to come to terms with in terms of understanding about how this process is going to play out. But let me give you this little anecdote here. A report issued by the New York Federal Reserve on February 12th found that U.S. companies and consumers were shouldering nearly 90% of the economic burden associated with the sweeping tariffs imposed last year. It confirms and aligns with a separate analysis that was published by the nonpartisan U.S. Congressional Budget Office, which estimated that about 70% of tariff costs were ultimately transferred to American consumers. Chuck Schumer, the leader of Democrats in the Senate, says this is a victory for the wallets of every American consumer. Trump's illegal tariff tax just collapsed. He tried to govern by decree and stuck families with the bill. Enough chaos. End the trade war. There we go.
All right, certainly. That is Sherwin Bryce Pease, live from us there from New York, and giving us the latest developments when it comes to that ruling from the Supreme Court in the U.S., and that pertaining to those tariffs which have been imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump.